Saipan, July 1944. Dawn rises through salt-white haze over the island's northern cliffs. Below, the Pacific folds against coral ridges with a sound like breath. The battle is officially over. But the war up here refuses to end. A Marine patrol moves cautiously toward a dark opening in the rock. They expect snipers, maybe a last desperate officer. Instead, from inside the cave comes a child's cry. One by one, the Marines lower their rifles. A medic switches on a small flashlight. In the pale beam are women in torn kimonos, faces streaked with ash. Some tremble, clutching infants wrapped in tatters. Their eyes show terror beyond exhaustion. They have been told that Americans will kill them, will kill their babies. The leader removes his helmet, kneels, and holds out a canteen. His voice is gentle but firm. It's okay. Water. For a moment, nobody moves. Then a mother reaches forward. The sound that follows, the first gulp of water, the weak cry of a thirsty child, quietly rewrites the final chapter of one of the Pacific's most brutal battles. War had stripped both sides of mercy. Yet somewhere inside a smoking jungle and a hollow cave, it began to return. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had become a campaign of physics, distance, fuel, and fire. The United States had fought its way through island chains whose names few Americans had known before the war: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Enewetak. Each victory pushed airfields closer toward Japan. Each mile of ocean wrestled from the Imperial Navy, tightened the noose around the home islands. The next step was the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, small volcanic ridges rising from blue infinity. Strategy turned those rocks into destiny. From them, B-29 superfortresses could finally reach Tokyo. For Japan, losing the Marianas would mean losing the war's initiative. For the United States, capturing them would mean striking the empire's heart. But there was something neither side fully prepared for: the presence of civilians on the battlefield. Saipan was home to over 25,000 Japanese settlers and natives working under military administration. When invasion came on 15th of June 1944, they became unwilling participants in total war. Japanese propaganda had spent years shaping their perception of the Allies. Official leaflets, school lessons, and radio speeches preached a single message: surrender brings torture. Capture means dishonor. Military police ensured the doctrine took hold. Officers distributed grenades to families with the instruction to die beautifully. Women were told that suicide was purity, that motherhood under defeat was shame. Children drilled with bamboo spears. The slogan Ichioku Gyokusai, the idea of 100 million shattered jewels, declared that death was purity, not loss. When the Americans arrived, 30,000 Marines and soldiers backed by naval artillery, the collision was not only military, it was psychological. For U.S. planners, Saipan represented progress in a long sequence of operations. For the civilians sheltering in fields and caves, it was apocalypse. They heard the shriek of naval shells, the drone of aircraft, and believed that the barbarians their teachers had described were descending to avenge the Pacific. The fighting lasted 3 deadly weeks. Japanese forces resisted to the last man. The largest organized Banzai charge of the war consumed nearly 4,000 troops in one night. Amid this chaos, civilians fled north into limestone cliffs. There, hemmed in by artillery smoke, rumors multiplied. Americans tortured prisoners, violated women, mutilated the dead. Fear metastasized into hysteria. American intelligence officers, fluent in Japanese from pre-war service or internment translations, tried to counter those myths. Through loudspeakers and leaflets, they promised safe treatment for surrendering civilians. Few believed it. Trust in 1944 was harder to build than bridges. When Marines began clearing caves after organized resistance collapsed, they found evidence of that fear. Families lying together beside unexploded grenades, children hidden under blankets, mothers still cradling infants in death. In their diaries, soldiers wrote of being unprepared for what compassion inside such horror required. One corporal confessed, "We came looking for soldiers. We found humanity, burned raw." News photographs from captured caves began circulating among American forces. A few depicted survivors, mothers clutching babies, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief while being offered food by medics under flickering torchlight. For men who had spent 3 years viewing the Japanese as faceless enemies, those images struck like revelation. Behind the front, Divisions of the U.S. Army Signal Corps recorded every sample of this new kind of encounter. Warfare intersecting mercy. At the same time, Japanese soldiers witnessing Americans handing water to civilians felt shaken. Compassion contradicted the core propaganda of the empire. Still, Saipan did not end in relief. On the island's north and on neighboring Tinian, thousands jumped from the cliffs of Marpi Point onto rocks below rather than surrender. Witnesses heard the cries, explosions of grenades, and the surf churning red. Even many American veterans would never erase those sounds. Yet amid the tragedy were exceptions, moments of voluntary surrender, of children pulled out alive, of medics improvising milk from emergency rations. Film reels captured Marines feeding babies with tin spoons while their mothers watched in stunned silence. For some, that moment redefined the purpose of victory itself. The lesson spread quietly through ranks. Defeating an army was war. Saving civilians was civilization. In the remaining months of 1944, whispers of those rescues traveled with the fleet, forward toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each new invasion would carry twice the blood, and yet somewhere in the headquarters planning rooms, officers began writing new lines into field orders about handling civilians, because after Saipan, they understood that the next battle would not only test weapons, it would test humanity itself. By late 1944, the lessons of Saipan echoed across the Pacific Command. What American troops had witnessed, the suicides, the caves of terrified families, forced military planners and psychologists to confront a truth no manual had prepared them for. Japanese civilians were not merely caught in the crossfire. They were targets of their own nation's propaganda. The Imperial Japanese government, still led by militarists who equated surrender with annihilation, intensified the message. Radio Tokyo broadcast warnings of an American slaughter, awaiting all who fell alive into Allied hands. Soldiers on remote islands were ordered to kill local civilians who spoke of truce or displayed white flags. Death, they said, was loyalty. From Hawaii to Washington, Allied intelligence assessed the psychological weight of this belief. The Office of War Information began analyzing intercepted letters from Japanese soldiers and civilians, discovering confessions of doubt, of fear, and sometimes curiosity about the enemy. It was enough to suggest that compassion could become a strategy. While generals prepared fleets and bombing missions, another front opened, one of persuasion and mercy. The United States Army founded language and culture sections at places like Camp Savage, Minnesota, where Nisei linguists, Japanese Americans fluent in both languages, trained to speak through loudspeakers on future battlefields. Their task? To tell frightened civilians not to die. New operational orders for invasions after Saipan included detailed protocols for civilian relief. Medics would carry supplies suitable for infants. Combat engineers were instructed to establish refuge areas marked by flags showing a red cross in Japanese text. Psychological warfare teams were attached to Marine divisions, equipped with loudspeakers, flyers, and interpreters. But even as these humanitarian precautions developed, the military expectation for resistance grew darker. U.S. commanders anticipated staggering casualties for the Japanese homeland invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall. Analysts predicted that up to 10 million civilians might take up arms or commit suicide. Before downfall could be attempted, the U.S. would have to invade Okinawa, a 60-mile-long island just 400 miles from Kyushu, crowded with 300,000 civilians. If Saipan had been horrific, Okinawa would become apocalyptic. The island bristled with caves and limestone ridges, ideal for defense. When Marines and soldiers landed on 1st April 1945, they faced not only a heavily entrenched Japanese army, but also an entire population drilled to resist capture. The Imperial garrison distributed grenades to families, repeating the same tragic doctrine, the same beautiful death. Civilians dug shelters under schools, temple courtyards, and sugarcane fields. Children practiced with sharpened sticks. Mothers carried poison bottles sewn into their sleeves. Leaflets distributed by U.S. aircraft promised safety, but most islanders could not read English, and many believed the leaflets were traps. The battle raged for nearly 3 months. Artillery shattered hills. Rain turned trenches into rivers. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and roughly 100,000 civilians died, many by their own hands. Yet through it all, a second story unfolded, one measured not in explosions, but in quiet gestures of compassion. American medics began reporting civilians emerging from caves waving improvised white flags, pieces of babies' clothing, bits of paper. Nurses and corpsmen crawled through scored valleys to treat survivors. Among the first to make contact were Nisei interpreters shouting through megaphones, "Nuganai! Anatatachi watasukarimasu. Don't be afraid. You will be helped." As word filtered back to headquarters that civilians were surrendering, commanders authorized humanitarian corridors through combat zones. Marine chaplains guided families to food stations. Navy doctors set up tents marked with kanji explaining their purpose. Hospital, children welcome. What had started as pragmatic culture warfare turned into genuine empathy. Soldiers who had lost comrades began cradling babies, sterilizing feeding bottles, even constructing small pens from ration crates to shelter infants. For many Marines hardened by years of brutal jungle campaigns, it was the first time they touched anything fragile since leaving home. Photographers of the U.S. Signal Corps recorded these scenes. American hands spoon-feeding malnourished children while their mothers knelt in disbelief. The images contradicted years of mutual dehumanization. Newspapers back home published sanitized versions as proof that victory had a moral dimension. For the Japanese on the receiving end, the revelation was staggering. The enemy devils had spared their children. Even amid the carnage of Okinawa, those acts or moments like them resonated with both sides. They exposed the quiet humanity buried under nationalist fury. They hinted that survival, not self-destruction, was the final resistance worth choosing. And from those human sparks flickering among the ruins would rise the next phase of this story, the confrontation between fear and compassion that defined the war's final months and set the moral stage for the rebuilding of post-war Japan. To understand the miracle of the rescues on Saipan and Okinawa, one has to begin with fear. For years, Japanese mothers had been told they would lose everything if captured. Surrender was an obscenity. Mercy was portrayed as weakness. In classrooms, teachers prepared children to die for the emperor. Instruction manuals for civilians, printed by Japan's Home Ministry, explained how mothers should hold grenades beneath their infants to ensure pure deaths. By the time American landing craft appeared offshore in 1944 and 1945, acts of kindness had become unthinkable variables. Yet face to face, the ideology collapsed. When frightened families emerged from caves, they saw, often for the first time, foreigners offering water. A nurse on Saipan recalled a mother's expression as she handed her baby to an American medic. She looked at him as if gravity had failed and she was floating between worlds. To the Marines, these encounters were equally transformative. Many had witnessed beheadings of captured airmen on other islands. Propaganda had warned that the Japanese have no words for mercy. Now they found terrified mothers who looked like civilians anywhere, faces streaked with salt tears, hair tangled with smoke. The shock restored something the Marines believed war had erased. Several wrote home saying these rescues felt more important than any ridge we took. Fear was not easily erased. Many women still waited days before leaving caves. But word spread. Captured interpreters relayed stories of babies fed by enemy hands. Gradually, belief reversed. If the barbarians protected children, perhaps they were not barbarians at all. At first, the humanitarian acts were spontaneous. By mid-1945, they were policy. U.S. psychological warfare planners realized that saving Japanese civilians undermined imperial propaganda faster than leaflets. Officers issued directives for identifying refugee zones, marking entrances of caves with white flags to signify safe passage. Chaplains and interpreters followed combat units broadcasting the same message in simplified Japanese. "We will not harm you. Do not die." In some sectors, it became as coordinated as battle plans. Marines set up small supply points with baby formulas infant stenciled on wooden crates. Combat field hospitals established separate wards for women and children to encourage surrender. Civil affairs officers wrote manuals detailing cultural etiquette. Avoid touching a woman's head. Do not gesture abruptly. Accept bows with slight nods to reduce fear. These instructions reached frontline commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Charles Shepard on Okinawa, who later said, We discovered it was cheaper in blood to save the innocent than to fight them. Japanese interpreter teams, many Nisei from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, served as voice bridges. They crawled to cave mouths under fire, calling into darkness for families to come out. Sometimes they did. Sometimes a grenade rolled back instead. No manual could erase the paranoia of years. Yet each successful surrender became an intelligence victory as well as a moral one. From a logistical standpoint, saving civilians also accelerated military objectives. Bringing non-combatants under control reduced risks of ambush and cleared movement routes. Sympathy and strategy merged, cold science serving an improbable human end. During the Okinawa campaign, Signal Corps photographers moved with infantry units under orders to document both combat and humanitarian operations. What their lenses captured would eventually traverse the world. American corpsmen feeding an infant from a canteen cup, a Marine sharing his rationed apple with a child, wounded Japanese prisoners lying beside U.S. soldiers in the same tent. The photographs arrived in American newspapers within weeks of Japan's surrender in August 1945. They contradicted anti-Japanese caricatures that had filled wartime propaganda. The public saw not enemy aliens but human faces rescued from the edge of extinction. For many Americans, these images became the first visual language of reconciliation. Technology changed not only warfare, but memory. Film transformed acts of individual mercy into historical record, testimony that morality could survive inside a machine age of annihilation. Behind every photo was an unseen act of risk. Combat medics often posed for pictures moments after dodging sniper fire or grenades. Cameramen worked with bulky speed graphic cameras whose bright flash could draw enemy attention. That any of their films survived is a statistical miracle in itself. Those negatives preserved in national archives reveal the texture of calm after storms, mask-like Japanese faces blinking at compassion, mothers clutching babies while American hands apply bandages. Each frame whispers what strategy reports can't. That redemption occurs in seconds, not in plans. The human, tactical, and technological angles of this story converge on one point: the reversal of indoctrinated hatred through simple mercy. In the next section, we see compassion resonate upward into leadership decisions, the enemy's psychological collapse, and moral reckonings that outlasted the Pacific Campaign itself. For both armies, leadership during the final year of the Pacific War meant operating within exhaustion and disbelief. At Allied headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur faced grim arithmetic: millions of Japanese still under arms, and a homeland indoctrinated to die fighting. Yet beneath their fiery communiqué sat a quieter directive circulating through subordinate commands, a reminder that mercy could be strategy. After Saipan, Nimitz personally ordered that captured civilians be treated with the full protection of international care. Medical officers on Guam and Tinian received crates of powdered milk and baby bottles earmarked for enemy dependents. It was logistical compassion on an industrial scale. On the ground, leadership often belonged to individuals improvising morality. On Okinawa, Lieutenant Colonel William M. Leverett of the 7th Infantry recorded breaking hierarchy when a terrified mother refused evacuation because of her child's fever. Her small cave was within a kill zone, but Leverett postponed artillery fire for 15 minutes to allow a Navy medic to enter. For saving that single family, his unit risked delay penalties. He later said simply, "It felt like the first thing in months that wasn't destruction." American leadership also learned to use kindness as intelligence. Doctors treating surrendered civilians discovered details of Japanese positions, confirming maps more effectively than reconnaissance aircraft. What began as sympathy produced information and shortened battles. Among the Japanese command, the same acts triggered cognitive collapse. Captured officers asked why U.S. Marines handed water to their wives when they themselves had failed to protect them. One survivor recorded, "Our lies have become dangerous. The enemy are behaving like men." The Imperial Army's rigid ideology cracked at its edges as those reports filtered back through remaining garrisons. By the time Okinawa ended, even Tokyo's senior staff knew the myth of the merciless American had been undone not by bombs, but by ethics. Inside the caves, psychological warfare unfolded at human frequency. Propaganda had forged an artificial monster. Direct experience erased it overnight. Civilians who accepted rescue described their astonishment in oral testimonies decades later. "We expected to be shot," recalled one woman from Naha City. "When the American gave my baby sugar water, I felt my knees fall by themselves." For the first time in the war, nurturing replaced annihilation. These moments eroded the mental blueprint of the imperial population. Japanese interpreters reported seeing mothers calling out to their hiding neighbors, assuring them through trembling voices that the enemy offered food. Tiny pockets of trust spread like sparks through ash. With every family that chose surrender, the cycle of fear shrank. For American psychological units recording these conversions, the value was immeasurable. Leaflets depicting Marines carrying infants achieved more influence than threats ever could. Within months, entire Japanese outposts began raising white flags accompanied by women and children, believing that proximity to civilians guaranteed fair treatment. Usually it did. To German or Soviet observers, Allied compassion seemed naive. To the Pacific veterans who witnessed it, it felt not like weakness but relief, an escape from the logic of total extermination. Even hardened combat officers joked grimly that nobody can shoot back when he's holding a baby. It was gallows humor, yet it revealed the transformation taking root. The Japanese front was learning disillusion the painful way. When loudspeaker company units broadcast pleas urging mothers to save their children, some civilians hesitated long enough to survive shelling. Each delay chipped away at the Empire's promise that death equaled honor. When the war ended shortly thereafter, those saved families embodied the quiet betrayal of militarism that no surrender document could formalize. Every war reaches a point where destruction transcends its purpose. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had become that threshold. Flames crawled over cities. The atom would soon split skies. Yet at the same time, in half-collapsed caves on Okinawa and Saipan, soldiers were kneeling beside enemy children, sharing bandages. In the diaries of Navy Corpsman Harold Bond appear the words, "We became fathers for 10 minutes. He described holding an infant whose mother could not stop shaking. He had killed Japanese soldiers hours earlier. In that cave, he said, the war finally sounded like silence. Such moral inversions transformed thousands of psyches. Marines who had arrived believing in racial hierarchies returned home questioning them. Many later supported post-war humanitarian missions in occupied Japan, distributing food and medicine to the same population they had once been told could never change. A seed of reconciliation took hold before politicians ever formalized peace. The veterans themselves rarely spoke of it publicly. Acts of mercy did not fit Hollywood's narrative of victory. But among those who carried the memory, the rescues remained the only parts of the war that did not corrode over time. Historians often argue that technology won World War II: radar, code breaking, the atomic bomb. Yet on islands gutted by artillery where mothers pressed infants to their chests in surrender, something older and simpler reclaimed relevance: empathy as resistance to barbarity. Through that fragile encounter, a soldier kneeling, a mother reaching, a child breathing, civilization endured long enough to face its next moral test. Those intertwined crises of command, psychology, and morality set the stage for the war's same emotional center. Its decisive moment not of power, but of recognition, when an empire's myth of righteous suicide gave way to the shared human instinct to keep a baby alive. That turning point happened within days at the cliffs and caves where blood met. Mercy and both sides realized the war's outcome extended far beyond victory or defeat. Saipan, July 9, 1944, the island smoldered. The roar of artillery had at last subsided into occasional cracks, sporadic reminders that the battle still breathed somewhere behind the hills. Marines approached the northernmost cliffs, weapons lowered but not ready for rest. They had heard noises all morning, screams, explosions, and something else. Crying. The jagged ledges of Marpy Point loomed against the gray Pacific. Beneath them, the sea churned with wreckage and bodies from what the Japanese called Gyokusai, the shattered jewel annihilation of Saipan's defense. Hundreds of soldiers and civilians had already plunged into the waves, choosing myth over mercy. Yet as one reconnaissance team neared the edge, they saw movement higher up the rock face, a woman clutching a bundle. Witness reports agree on the smallest detail: The infant was still alive. The Marines froze. Training had not prepared them for this. Kamikazes they understood. Banzai charges they expected. But a mother standing at the cliff's lip, rocking a baby, was something no manual covered. Through binoculars, a chaplain among them read terror in her posture. She was waiting for the Americans to approach to confirm her orders of propaganda that death was better than capture. The chaplain raised empty hands. "Don't jump," she hesitated. Waves broke against the cliff below like gunfire. Then a second Marine, young, sun-blistered, held out a canteen and climbed toward her with slow, trembling balance. Each movement risked a misstep on glass-sharp coral. A gust came, the woman shrieked, and the baby cried. The Marine stopped, crouched, and lowered his helmet full of water. He placed it on the ground between them and backed away. For minutes, no one moved. When she finally stepped forward, the watching soldiers exhaled as if the island itself had released breath. The small gesture, the helmet of water, had cracked the armor of myth. Within hours, word spread through other caves and cliffs. Families hiding nearby, some wounded, some delirious, realized not every voice calling in English meant vengeance. Interpreters shouted assurances, "You will not be harmed. Bring the babies." Dozens responded. By nightfall, refugees stumbled into American lines by torchlight. A corpse medic triaged them on the sand, calling for magnesium milk and bandages while stretcher bearers brought more survivors down from the high ground. In the war's arithmetic, these rescues changed almost nothing. Saipan remained devastated, tens of thousands dead. Strategically, the island was secured. But inside that brief suspension of violence, both armies witnessed something larger than victory. Corpsman Dale Ayres later wrote in his logbook, "We held a truce without talking about it. Mothers couldn't believe we meant no harm. We couldn't believe anyone had told them we would." For Japanese officers who survived to tell the story, that night marked another kind of realization, that the Emperor's armies had created a lie more absolute than defeat. The order for civilians to die rather than surrender had turned imperial ideals into murder. Seeing enemy medics cradle Japanese infants shattered what remained of indoctrination. Photographs taken the next morning show Marines handing biscuits through a cave entrance, women shielding their eyes from the flash, babies clinging to helmets larger than their heads. The images circulated in both directions, among Allied units as proof of compassion, and later among captured Japanese soldiers as evidence that honor could mean life. Those quiet scenes formed the emotional fulcrum of the war in the Pacific. After Saipan, the road to Japan's surrender was still soaked in blood. Iwo Jima and Okinawa would carry horrors beyond comprehension. But the moral tide had begun to recede. Even amidst the violence to come, Allied commanders ordered expanded medical facilities for civilian care. Compassion had proven military value. For the survivors on Saipan, the rescue became legend. Years later, Japanese mothers who lived through it would write in memoirs that the men from across the sea did not shout or strike. They spoke softly, like breezes on coral. In that summer of death, a helmet filled with water had whispered the first words of peace. The resonance of that encounter carried forward a year later to Okinawa, where cliffs and caves once again became both tomb and refuge, and where the boundary between enemy and savior would finally dissolve altogether. Okinawa, June 1945. The sky above the Shuri line glowed red from days of ceaseless shelling. The island had turned into a furnace of mud and stone. Civilians, farmers, fishermen, teachers, entire families, hid in caves perforating the hillsides, praying to outlast both armies. For many, this was the end of the world. American loudspeakers broadcast through the chaos. "Do not die. Bring your children out. We will help you." The words rolled across valleys already deafened by artillery. Few believed them. Every rumor from Saipan had been rewritten by Imperial police officers into fresh warnings. "Do not trust the enemy. They will take your babies," but hunger made skepticism thin. 2 miles east of Naha, a platoon from the 7th Infantry stumbled on a cave system filled with survivors. The air inside was blackened with soot. Corpsman Louis Howard crawled through the narrow entrance on his stomach, a white flag tied to his wrist. He used no gun, only gauze and a flashlight. He spoke no Japanese, but he carried milk tablets crushed into paste. One woman bit his sleeve as he tried to touch her child's wrist to check a pulse. He didn't move away. When she saw him smile, exhaustion replaced panic. She allowed him to stay. Outside, Marines formed a perimeter, hauling boxes of field rations to the mouth of the cave. What emerged were not soldiers but ghosts. Women with hair singed by explosions, children streaked with limestone dust. Many infants were blind from smoke exposure. Navy nurses washed their skin with canteen water and wrapped them in parachute silk torn from cargo drops. For the first time in 82 days of combat, gunfire paused near that sector. It was not an order. It was instinct. Reporters embedded with the troops photographed what happened next. A line of American medics feeding Japanese babies from IV tubes converted into makeshift bottles. One image taken by Private Tomlinson would later appear in Life magazine. It showed a Marine bent over a newborn, his helmet resting on the ground like an offering. The caption read, "After the battle, humanity returns." Word of the rescues reached both commands. U.S. officers authorized full-scale evacuation of civilians from caves, hundreds at first, then thousands. Trucks marked evacuee. Children on board shuttled between combat areas and rear hospitals. Coordinators kept tallies, age, gender, condition. Each name captured by pencil was a life reclaimed from abyss. For Japanese survivors, disbelief turned to reverence. Some mothers attempted to leave small gifts beside the corpsmen treating their children. A hairpin, a prayer bead, a folded paper crane. When told they didn't need to pay, they wept silently. These moments unfolded even as battle raged yards away. Navy guns still fired inland. Kamikaze planes still struck destroyers offshore. War did not stop for kindness, but kindness persisted beneath its noise. A witness account from interpreter George Tarauka, a Japanese-American sergeant, captured the transition vividly. Each time we convinced one group to come out, another would see them survive and decide to live. It spread like light in a tunnel. We weren't winning ground, we were winning trust. By mid-June, Okinawa's humanitarian operations had become the largest of the Pacific War. Temporary village camps under Allied supervision housed an estimated 60,000 survivors. Alongside concrete bunkers filled with weapons now stood tents labeled in Japanese. Hospital, milk station, children's area. What had begun as isolated acts of compassion became structured relief for the American soldiers who had marched through years of wars. Dehumanization, from Pearl Harbor's vengeance to Iwo Jima's annihilation, the change was profound. Veteran of both campaigns, Sergeant Raymond Davis said later, "At Iwo Jima, we killed everything that moved. At Okinawa, we learned to tell the difference between an enemy and a child." Even Tokyo's remaining leadership noted the humanitarian division's efficiency. Intelligence summaries recovered after the war contained shocked commentary. Enemy provides medical care to civilians. Contradiction in their character unexplainable. Propaganda ineffective. The phrase unexplainable was, in effect, the war's obituary. On Okinawa's high ground, where caves opened toward the sea, death still ruled. Yet amid corpse smoke and disinfectant, life had reasserted itself. U.S. medical officers tallied hundreds of births in the final month of fighting, children born under Allied fire, delivered by Japanese midwives working beside Navy nurses. Every cry punctured the myth that war could erase innocence. When combat finally ceased that July, the Americans buried their dead, tended their prisoners, and housed the living. In one photograph taken at the end of the campaign, an American baby, born on a hospital ship off Okinawa, lies beside a Japanese infant rescued from northern hills. The caption simply reads, "Two new citizens of the same sea. That symmetry, two children breathing, above the graves of 200,000 others, became the living monument of the Pacific War's most paradoxical victory. Mercy had survived massacre, and from that survival, the path toward occupation and reconciliation would unfold, guided by soldiers who had learned that saving a single child could silence entire guns. The aftermath of those rescues would shape psychological warfare, diplomacy, and memory itself, turning a battlefield of annihilation into the foundation of a peace that neither side had imagined possible. The ceasefire on Okinawa arrived without ceremony. No banners, no triumphal marches, just the metallic echo of weapons being stacked and the smell of salt rising from rain-soaked trenches. For days afterward, Marines and soldiers wandered through tunnels and ravines searching for the living among the dead. Every voice that answered in Japanese drew men running with stretchers instead of rifles. In the weeks following the battle, Allied forces evacuated over 80,000 civilians, most sick or malnourished, half of them children. The improvised nursery tents built during combat now expanded into formal relief camps patterned after field hospitals. Rows of canvas shelters stretched along beaches once aimed at by naval guns. Inside, Navy doctors and Japanese midwives worked side by side. Sticky summer air clung to the smell of antiseptic and powdered milk. American mechanics donated Jeep batteries to power lamps for night berths. Signal Corps photographers continued filming, no longer for propaganda but for record-keeping. These were the first frames of peace. Language barriers blurred, yet gestures carried meaning. Sergeant Lou Howard, the medic who had crawled into a cave weeks earlier, spent his last days on the island patching toy wagons together from ammunition crates. A military interpreter later wrote that local children called him Ocha-san no Otoko, the man of tea, because he poured canned milk into cups like ritual. For the mothers, the shock never fully left. They whispered prayers to the Shinto gods, unable to reconcile survival with the promise of honorable death drilled into them since childhood. Many assumed the Americans would separate them from their infants. Instead, they watched those same men sterilize bottles and measure medicine. British reporter visiting in August 1945 described walking across an evacuation site where American guards held newborns while Japanese nurses washed bedding in buckets. No words, he wrote, only care. The same ocean that had been a combat zone now reflected the shapes of laundry lines hung between truck frames. U.S. military command treated the relief operations as something beyond conquest. The Civil Affairs Division drafted new guidelines defining captured civilians not as prisoners, but as liberated peoples. It was a subtle line, politically cautious, yet spiritually enormous. Behind those words hid a realization. Ending the war would require more than Japan's surrender. It needed Japan's healing. For American servicemen, the transformation was personal. Letters home changed tone. After years of demonization, soldiers described Japanese civilians with startled affection. They looked just like our kids, dirty and hungry, but kids all the same. One Marine wrote to his wife in Pennsylvania, "I never thought I'd be any good at feeding applesauce to an enemy baby." Stories like that reached American newspapers and quietly altered public sentiment. The Pacific Campaign had birthed the image of the brutal island war. Now photographs of mothers smiling weakly with U.S. medics entered the collective conscience. It hinted that even in the hardest theater, humanity had reemerged. For the Japanese survivors, the humanitarian miracle reverberated far beyond Okinawa. Many were transferred to internment or resettlement camps on nearby islands where American supplies and doctors continued assistance. Some wrote anonymous notes in careful brush script. "We believed lies. Thank you for giving water to our children." Psychologists embedded with the occupation forces later noted that gratitude became a bridge across a cultural abyss. The rescued mothers, once used as tools of propaganda, became living refutations of militarism. They told neighbors and relatives that the foreigners had not slaughtered them. Their testimonies circulated like private gospel through the ruins of rural Japan, far more persuasive than any political declaration. Meanwhile, in Washington, policy boards studying how to occupy Japan cited these events. The Civilization Division of the War Department argued that humanitarian diplomacy, shown on Saipan and Okinawa, should guide Reconstruction policy. "Feeding is control," one strategist wrote coldly yet correctly. "Mercy creates influence where victory cannot." The occupation that followed would prove the point. When American troops landed on Japan's mainland that September, families did not flee. They watched from doorways as soldiers distributed rice instead of gunfire. Some even sent children forward to greet the newcomers. The fear that had fueled suicides on Saipan had vanished in one generation's breath. The field nurses and medics who had acted out of impulse saw the consequence ripple across an entire nation. Japan met its conquerors without rebellion. And that calm had begun in caves where compassion crawled, forward under fire. The next stage of the aftermath reveals how those small encounters shaped the politics, reconciliation, and moral memory of the post-war decades. How the deeds of anonymous corpsmen and terrified mothers evolved into the foundation of U.S.-Japanese trust and remembrance. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, the world's attention turned to the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Cameras captured generals, admirals, and diplomats signing the end of the bloodiest war in history. Yet far from that spectacle were the quiet architects of surrender, the nameless soldiers who had chosen compassion on Saipan and Okinawa. Their actions had rewired how Japan perceived its conqueror before the peace papers were signed. Occupation forces landing on mainland Japan entered a nation expecting vengeance and instead found welcome. No civilian insurrections, no mass suicides. General Douglas MacArthur later remarked to aides that he expected 10 outbreaks of resistance before one handshake, but encountered precisely the opposite. Historians now trace that unexpected calm to the unforgettable stories carried inland. American soldiers saving Japanese babies, Marines sharing water on Saipan, nurses feeding crying children on Okinawa. Word of those events had spread through survivors' letters and family networks, softening fear into wary hope. At the governmental level, compassion became strategy. MacArthur's occupation charter emphasized protection of women and children. Food distribution began even before disarmament. American medical teams entered devastated cities distributing penicillin and powdered milk. But beneath the official relief was a moral undercurrent first tested in those island caves. Treat mercy as strength. The Japanese press, tightly censored during the war, rushed to document the contrast. Newspapers in Tokyo and Osaka printed new photographs of Allied medics tending civilians. Magazines published diaries of Okinawan mothers rescued with their infants. The astonishment was palpable. "They were enemies," read one column, "yet they acted as if we were human beings." American correspondents noticed the shift and recorded it for public memory. Life colliers, and the Saturday Evening Post featured returning Marines describing faces that looked at us not in hate but in disbelief. These accounts loosened American hatred that had solidified since Pearl Harbor. Compassion had moved in both directions. It became a bridge across the Pacific wider than diplomacy. In Japan's emerging post-war culture, that bridge grew into folklore. School textbooks of the early 1950s, produced under Allied supervision, cited the humanitarian conduct of occupation troops. Teachers told students that the Americans who had once bombed their cities also saved lives, an idea once unthinkable. It paralleled the United States' portrayal of post-war Japan as capable of democracy. Mutual transformation began at the most elemental level, mothers and children surviving to tell their stories. Those stories continued quietly through decades. In 1954, a delegation of Okinawan women traveled to Hawaii to meet Medical Corps veterans. Among them was a nurse who had survived the Shuri Line caves. She recognized one of the men who had carried her newborn. Their reunion, captured by newsreel, showed what treaties could not: forgiveness practiced through touch. They stood surrounded by reporters, the fatherly American sailor holding her toddler grandson for photographs. His uniform faded, but his eyes wet. Back in Japan, grassroots movements formed around the survivors of wartime islands. Local memorials on Saipan and Okinawa began citing not only the fallen but also the compassionate soldiers. In the late 1950s, a plaque carved at Marpy Point quietly included a phrase that startled visiting veterans: "For those who fought, those who died, and those who chose to save." American diplomats drew on these symbolic gestures during the tense early Cold War. The rhetoric of humanitarian victory helped legitimize a new alliance between former enemies. When Japan signed its peace treaty with the United States in 1951, the emotional groundwork had already been laid by the remembered image of a Marine handing water to a mother. For veterans, the legacy felt deeply personal. Many who'd fought through the Pacific carried guilt for scenes of devastation. Some wrote that the few minutes spent delivering babies or feeding refugees were the only parts of the war worth keeping. Humanitarian veterans groups later sponsored scholarships for Japanese children. A handful of former corpsmen even returned to live in Okinawa as doctors or teachers. Half a century later, when historians interviewed Okinawan elders who had been infants during the battle, nearly every family had a version of the same sentence: "An American soldier saved me." Their sincerity transformed battlefield ghosts into shared ancestors of peace. The most haunting reflection came from Japanese historian Saburo Ienaga, who wrote, "The war ended not when the emperor spoke, but when a mother found that her enemy had saved her child." It summarized what weapons could never declare. Civilization survived because individuals refused to forget compassion. From that revelation, two nations constructed a fragile but lasting partnership. Out of the caves of despair came a vision of coexistence, proof that even amid mass death, the smallest human gesture could shape the peace of generations. The story's echo, still felt in every reconciliation ceremony and every alliance handshake, leads to its final reflection: what this moment meant for humanity when survival itself became the highest form of victory. When the Pacific War closed, few looked for meaning among the ashes. History remembered mushroom clouds, signatures, and the vocabulary of victory. But on lonely islands once scorched by fire, history was also written in silence, in a cave where a mother and a medic faced one another without a word. Those moments reshaped more than battles. They redefined what it meant to win. The men who had carried rifles found themselves carrying infants. Women who had been told that surrender was dishonor learned that survival could be sacred. Out of that realization grew a miracle greater than conquest: empathy strong enough to cross language, grief, and guilt. Years later, the Allied and Japanese veterans who met again discovered they remembered the same thing. Not the roar of guns or the shock of surrender, but the quiet weight of small lives saved by instinct. Mercy had done what weapons could not. It turned enemies into witnesses of each other's humanity. That is the lingering truth of Saipan and Okinawa. The war that began with absolute hatred ended with broken soldiers teaching each other how to be human again. Their compassion became Japan's first experience of democracy, America's first gesture of post-war reconciliation, and the world's reminder that even in annihilation's shadow, kindness is strategy, not weakness. Modern visitors standing at the cliffs of Marpi Point or walking through Okinawa's Peace Memorial hear little but wind and waves. Yet beneath that calm the echoes remain, not of gunfire but of children's laughter carried by the sea. It is the soft testimony of a generation that proved survival could be an act of courage, that mercy could end a war. The mothers who once trembled in disbelief and the soldiers who extended their hands never knew they were shaping the century's moral compass. But they did. Each outstretched palm, each shared cup of water was the true armistice long before pen met paper in Tokyo Bay. The Pacific now lies quiet between two nations once defined by fear. Its tides keep the secret well, that the end of hatred begins where compassion dares to reach across the line.